The sun beat down on the trading post, hot and merciless. Folks came and went, stepping around the old woman sitting on the porch like she was part of the dust. Her dress was torn, her eyes hollow, her hands clutching a small locket. "My daughter said she'd be right back," she whispered, voice cracking. But the stagecoach was long gone. Hours passed. Then a man in a worn hat rode up a poor cowboy, dirt on his boots, decency in his eyes. He offered her water, a place to rest. "Ain't no one should be left behind out here," he said. She didn't know it yet, but that moment the kindness of one forgotten man would bring her back to life. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The road to Sam Dwyer's homestead wound through dry, empty land, the kind of country that made a man quiet. Dust lifted behind the wagon wheels in long, tired trails, and the sun hung low enough now that the shadows stretched thin across the ridge. The woman sat beside him, small and still beneath the threadbare shawl he'd given her, her hands clutching that locket like she feared it might vanish if she loosened her grip. Sam didn't ask her more than her name, Margaret, and she didn't offer more than that. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, the kind of voice worn down by sorrow instead of time. He'd seen that look before, in the faces of widows and mothers waiting for sons who never came back from the mines or the wars. But there was something else in her eyes, too, a flicker of guilt that ran deeper than grief, like she carried a burden that had been hers alone to bear. The wind picked up as they crested the hill, tossing grit into the air and whistling through the mesquite. When his small ranch came into view, a one-room cabin with a lean-to stable and a crooked fence that barely kept the world out, he felt a twinge of embarrassment at its meager state. Still, it was clean, solid, honest. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, offering his hand. "Ain't much," he said, "but it'll do for the night." Margaret hesitated before taking his hand, her fingers cold and trembling. As he helped her down, he noticed how light she was, like the world had already taken everything it could from her and left only a shell behind. Inside, he got a fire going, the smell of coffee soon filling the small room. The sound of the kettle seemed to ease the silence between them. She sat near the hearth, staring into the flames as if searching for something she'd lost there. He watched her for a while, the firelight catching on the silver locket in her hand. It was delicate, out of place in a world that had no time for finery. He could tell she'd held onto it for years, maybe through storms, maybe through worse. "You got kin waiting on you somewhere?" he asked finally, his voice gentle. She didn't look up. "No," she said after a long pause. "No one waitin'." Her tone made it clear she didn't want pity, and Sam didn't offer it. He just nodded, poured her a tin cup of coffee, and set it by her knee. "Well," he said quietly, "you're safe here, Miss Margaret. Storm's got no say inside these walls." She blinked, as if startled by the kindness, and murmured something that sounded like, "Thank you," though her voice cracked halfway through. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, dragging its dry fingers across the boards like an old memory trying to get in. Sam tossed another log on the fire and leaned back in his chair, the heat painting his face in flickering gold. He wasn't a man given to charity life on the plains, didn't leave much room for it, but there was something about this woman that stirred an old ache in him, the kind he thought he'd buried with his past. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to that trading post alone, waiting for someone who'd never come back. Margaret sipped her coffee slowly, staring into the flames, and for the first time that day, her shoulders loosened just enough to let a breath of peace in. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and silent under the darkening sky, the kind of silence that held stories best left untold. But in that small cabin, the air felt a little warmer, and Sam Dwyer, a man used to loneliness, found himself hoping, against all reason, that maybe he'd done something good just by stopping that day. The night settled heavy over the plains, the kind of still darkness that made every creak of timber sound like a memory stirring. The wind had died down hours ago, leaving only the faint hiss of embers in the hearth and the rhythmic ticking of the old clock Sam kept on the mantel. Margaret had fallen asleep near the fire, her shawl draped over her shoulders, the locket resting in her palm like a charm against the cold. Sam sat at the table, mending a bridle strap by lantern light, the small scraping of his needle the only sound in the room. It was a quiet he was used to, a working man's quiet, but that night, It felt uneasy, as though the walls themselves were waiting for something. When the first sound came a soft whimper, then a choked sob. He thought at first it was the wind finding its way through the cracks again. But then he heard her voice, faint and trembling, saying words that didn't belong to dreams. "Please, don't go. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Sam looked up, the bridle falling from his hands. Margaret was sitting upright now, her face bathed in the orange glow of the dying fire, eyes glassy and unfocused. "Anna," she whispered, her voice breaking on the name. "Please, forgive me." The sound of it so raw, so full of something too human to ignore, cut through him sharper than any blade. He crossed the room quietly, crouching beside her just as she jolted awake. For a moment she looked lost, eyes darting like a cornered animal's, until she saw him and the fight went out of her shoulders. Her breathing came quick and uneven. "You were dreamin'," he said softly. "Just a dream." But she shook her head, clutching the locket to her chest. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't." Tears welled in her eyes, and before he could say more, the words began to spill out, ragged and unbidden. "I gave her everything I had, everything, and still, it wasn't enough." Her fingers tightened around the blaying locket until her knuckles went white. "She said she'd come back for me, said once she married, I'd never have to want again. But when her husband died and the debts came, she—" Margaret stopped, her voice faltering under the weight of memory. "She sold the land, my land, left me with nothing but this." She opened the locket then, her hands shaking. Inside, the firelight caught two small portraits, a younger woman proud and smiling, and a little girl with curls like sunlight. "My daughter," she said, "and my granddaughter, both gone." Her breath hitched. The fever took the child, the shame took her mother. She looked at him then, eyes wet and shining, as if daring him to pity her. But Sam didn't speak. He knew that kind of hurt, the kind that sat too deep for words. He just sat beside her, the heat of the fire pressing against his face, and stared into the flames with her. After a while, she whispered, "You ever lose someone, Mr. Dwyer?" He nodded. "Once. A wife," he said quietly. "Long time ago." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, shared. The kind that made two strangers feel like kin for a moment. Outside, the coyotes called to one another, lonely and low, their cries carried by the wind across the open land. Margaret drew her shawl tighter and stared into the embers until her tears dried. Sam rose slowly, added another log to the fire, and sat back down without another word. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He didn't tell her to sleep. He just stayed there, a steady presence in the flickering light. Because sometimes, he figured, a person didn't need saving, they just needed someone to sit with them in the ruins of what they'd lost, until the night passed. The next morning broke clear and sharp, sunlight spilling over the hills like it was trying to wash away the night's ghosts, but the quiet in Sam Dwyer's chest lingered. Margaret had slept late, worn out from tears she'd probably been holding back for years, and he didn't have the heart to wake her. He saddled his old bay mare, Dusty, loaded his empty sacks for feed and coffee, and told her he'd be back by evening. She just nodded from the doorway, her shawl tight around her shoulders, eyes soft but distant. The road to town was long and rutted, and by the time he reached the main street of Dunswell, the air was already thick with dust and gossip, the kind that stuck to you if you weren't careful. He hitched his horse outside the general store, tipped his hat to the clerk, and started filling his list. The moment he mentioned needing extra flour and sugar, the man behind the counter arched a brow. "Expectin' company, Sam?" he asked. Voice casual but eyes sharp. Sam didn't answer right away, just folded his arms. "Got someone staying out my way," he said evenly. "Old gal needed a roof and a meal." The clerk snorted. "Ah, you mean the one from the Post. Folks been talkin'." Sam didn't ask, but the man kept on, lowering his voice. "She's trouble, that one. Her daughter ran off with some banker's money a few years back, ruined his reputation. Heard tell the mother was in on it." He leaned forward. "You'd do best to send her on her way before the law comes poking around." Sam's jaw tightened. "Appreciate the advice," he said flatly, tossing coins on the counter and grabbing his supplies. Outside, two ranch hands leaned against a wagon, their conversation stopping as he passed. "Ain't like Dwyer to take in strays," one said. "Must be the locket she's got. Bet it's worth something." The other chuckled. "Wouldn't surprise me. Heard the banker she stole from remarried, livin' high off her. Money now. Folks in Carson City still talk about it." Sam didn't turn around, but the words followed him all the way down the street like burrs in his coat. He finished his errands in silence, mounting Dusty just as the sun began to dip. The ride home felt longer than usual. The prairie stretched endless before him, golden and quiet. But his thoughts weren't. He'd seen men ruined by gossip before seen lives torn apart by words that didn't weigh an ounce but carried farther than any bullet. Still, as much as he hated to admit it, curiosity had taken hold. When he got back, the cabin was warm, the smell of stew faint in the air. Margaret was seated near the fire, sewing a tear in her shawl, her face lit by the flicker of the flames. She looked up when he entered, smiling softly. "You were gone long," she said. "Town's busy," he replied, setting down the supplies. He hesitated, then noticed the locket lying open on the table beside her. She must have taken it off to rest her hands, and for the first time, he could see the tiny script engraved inside the rim, a name almost worn away by time. Clara Hensley. The same name he'd heard whispered behind his back not an hour ago. He felt the air tighten in his chest, not from suspicion but from something heavier, a sense that the truth he'd stumbled on wasn't meant for him. Margaret must have noticed his gaze because she reached for the locket quickly, snapping it shut. "Old memories," she murmured, avoiding his eyes. He nodded slowly, not pressing, but when she looked away, his mind was already circling the same question over and over. If Clara Hensley was her daughter and the banker's new wife, the story he'd heard in town wasn't gossip at all. It was the beginning of something much larger. Something that had driven this woman across miles of dust and regret to his door. Later that night, when she'd gone to bed and the fire burned low, Sam sat alone at the table, turning his cup in his hands. The prairie wind brushed against the windows like a whisper from the dark, carrying the town's cruel tongues with it. But beneath the noise, one thought kept echoing: what kind of mother carries a secret so heavy it makes her run from her own child? And what kind of man would he be if he didn't find out why? The truth came slow, like the first crack of dawn after a long, bitter night. And when it finally did, it hurt worse than any wound Sam Dwyer had ever carried. It was late again, the prairie dark and still outside, the fire burning low in the hearth. Margaret sat in her usual chair by the flames, her shawl draped around her thin shoulders, the locket glinting faintly in the light. She'd been quiet all evening, quieter than usual, and Sam could feel the weight of something building between them, something she'd been holding back since the first night he found her trembling on that porch. He didn't push her, not at first. He'd learned long ago that people broke in their own time, but when she spoke his name softly, as though afraid it might shatter if she said it too loud, he knew the moment had come. "Sam," she said, her voice a rasp of smoke and sorrow. "You ought to know what I've done." He turned from the table, setting aside the knife he'd been sharpening, and met her gaze. Her eyes were clearer than he'd ever seen them, but behind them, something fragile trembled. "You don't owe me nothin'," he said gently, but she shook her head, clutching the locket to her chest like it was the last piece of herself she had left. "Yes, I do. I owe the truth." The firelight danced across her face as she began, each word slow and deliberate, carved out of years of silence. "My daughter Clara, she was a bright thing once. Smart, pretty, full of plans. When her pa died, we lost near everything, but she said she'd make it right, and she did, for a time. Caught the eye of a banker from Carson City, fine man, rich, generous, promised her the world." She paused, staring into the flames. "When she wrote to me, she said she'd send for me soon, said I'd never want again. I believed her." Sam listened, arms folded, his jaw tight as a drawn rein. "But when the letter came," Margaret went on, her voice thinning, "it was shorter, colder. Said the coach would come, but not to wear my old clothes, that she'd have new ones waiting for me. Like she was ashamed of the life she'd come from." Her breath hitched. "I rode all that way, Sam. Dressed in my Sunday best, clutching the locket she gave me when she first left home. When I stepped off that coach, she was there. Only she wasn't the same. She looked like the world had washed her clean of everything she'd been. Her hair was pinned, her gloves white as snow, and when she saw me, really saw me, she hesitated. Just for a moment. Then she smiled, that tight kind of smile you give when someone's watchin'. Told me to wait while she fetched the carriage. Margaret's eyes glossed over, distant and full of ghosts. She never came back. Sam felt something hard and cold twist in his gut. You're telling me she left you there, at the post? She nodded, tears spilling freely now. I waited till sundown. Then I waited some more. Folks passed me by like I was a beggar woman. By the time I realized she wasn't comin', the stage had gone and I couldn't make myself leave. I thought maybe she'd change her mind. Her voice broke on the last word. But she didn't. She looked at me like I was a stain she couldn't scrub clean. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the pop of the fire. Sam stood there, fists clenched at his sides, the muscles in his jaw working. He'd seen men do cruel things for money. But this kind of betrayal wasn't greed. It was shame, the kind that rotted a soul from the inside out. Money don't buy honor, he said finally, his voice low and steady. Never has. Margaret looked up at him, eyes shimmering. I wasn't good enough for her world, she whispered. And now she'll never be part of mine. Sam crossed the room then, kneeling beside her chair, his hand resting lightly on hers. Ain't about worlds, ma'am, he said softly. It's about the kind of person you are when no one's looking. And from where I stand, you're worth 10 of her. She tried to smile, but it came out as a trembling line of gratitude and grief. Outside, the night wind sighed through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of rain on the air. The fire cracked, sending a single spark up the chimney, and Sam realized that some truths didn't bring peace, they just made the silence a little more honest. The morning came with a red sky and a restless wind, the kind that made the dust rise before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Sam saddled Dusty before breakfast, his movements sharp and deliberate, anger simmering beneath the quiet set of his jaw. Margaret had fallen back asleep near the fire, her face softer in the glow, and for a moment he'd almost changed his mind, almost convinced himself it wasn't his place to stir up old wounds. But the thought of that frail woman waiting by the road, clutching a locket and a promise that never came true, burned in his chest like a coal that wouldn't cool. So he left her a note, gone to town. Won't be long. And rode out under the rising heat. By the time he reached Dunswell, the streets were already alive with wagons and gossip. The bank sat at the end of Main Street, its whitewashed porch gleaming too bright against the dust. That's where he saw her, Clara Hensley, standing in the shade beside a man in a tailored coat who looked like he'd never worked a day in his life. She was every inch what Margaret had described, poised, lovely, her hair pinned high and her dress finer than any Sam had seen this side of Carson City. She was laughing softly at something the banker said, but when Sam stepped off his horse and started toward her, the sound died in her throat. Her eyes widened, not in recognition, but in the wary way folks looked when the past came walking toward them in the daylight. Mrs. Hensley? Sam said, tipping his hat just enough to be polite. The banker, her husband, he guessed, glanced up, surprised by the interruption. Can I help you, sir? No, sir. Sam replied, his voice calm but firm. Just here to deliver a message to your wife. Clara's face paled, her gloved hands twisting around her purse. Mr. Dwyer, she said quickly, a tremor in her voice. Please, not here. The banker's eyes flicked between them, confusion giving way to irritation. You know, this man? He brought supplies out to my family's place once before I married, she said, forcing a brittle smile. Old acquaintance. Sam's patience thinned. Reckon I'm more than that now, he said evenly. Found your mother out by the trading post. Near starved. Waiting on a coach that never came. She's alive. Been living under my roof since. Clara froze. Her husband blinked. Your mother? He asked, surprised. Clara's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, but her voice came out smooth, practiced. That must be a mistake. My mother passed years ago. Sam's eyes narrowed. Ain't no mistake. She told me her name. Same as you did once, Margaret. Showed me the locket you gave her. He reached into his coat, pulling out the folded note she'd written to him days earlier, her shaky handwriting proof of her truth. She's waiting for you. he said quietly, still hoping you might look her in the eye. Clara's face went rigid. For a heartbeat, he thought she might break, that something in her would soften, but instead she turned slightly, her back straightening. "You don't understand," she whispered, low enough that her husband couldn't hear. "My husband, he can't know. He won't have it. The family name, the papers already said she was gone." Sam took a step closer, his voice rough with disbelief. "You already left her once, ma'am. Don't do it again." Her lip trembled, but she looked away, toward the polished glass of the bank window, her reflection trembling in it like a ghost. "You don't know what it's like," she murmured. "I worked too hard to build this life. I can't." "Can't what?" he cut in, his tone sharper now. "Can't own up to what you did? To who you come from?" The banker cleared his throat, sensing tension. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice cold. "No, sir," Sam said, his gaze never leaving Clara's. "No problem at all. Just a woman forgetting her roots." He tipped his hat once, slow and deliberate, then turned on his heel and mounted Dusty without another word. Behind him, he heard the banker murmur something, the rustle of silk as Clara's composure cracked. But he didn't look back. The ride home felt heavier than any trail he'd ever taken. The land seemed to stretch wider, the sky harsher, and the dust rose behind him like the ghost of all the things folks chose to bury. By the time his cabin came into view, the sun had begun to set, painting the world in bruised gold. Margaret was waiting by the fence, her shawl fluttering in the wind. She smiled when she saw him, but the sight of her hopeful, fragile, still waiting made his stomach twist. He slid off his horse slowly, his voice rough when he said, "I found her." And though she didn't ask, the look in his eyes told her the rest. The rain had started sometime after midnight, a soft patter at first that grew into a steady drumming against the roof, the kind that sank into the soil and turned everything to mud. Sam woke to it, uneasy, a cold draft slipping under the door. The fire had long burned out, and the cabin felt wrong, too quiet, too empty. When he looked toward the corner where Margaret's cot sat, his heart sank. The blanket lay folded, neat and untouched, her shawl gone from its peg. For a moment, he just stood there, the truth dawning slow and heavy. She'd gone, out there, somewhere, in the rain. He pulled on his coat and boots, heart pounding, and stepped into the downpour. The world outside was a blur of gray and wet, the hills melting into the horizon. He knelt by the edge of the yard, spotting her faint footprints, small, unsteady, half-washed by the storm but still there, winding down the trail toward Dunswell. He cursed under his breath, grabbed his horse's reins, and followed. The ride was rough, the rain cutting sideways, the wind howling like a wounded thing. But he pushed through it, keeping his eyes on the tracks whenever they reappeared in the mud. He found her at last near the churchyard, standing barefoot in the grass by the old white steeple. The place looked ghostly in the rain, crosses half swallowed by weeds, the bells silent above them. Margaret stood motionless, her dress soaked through, her gray hair plastered to her cheeks, the locket glinting faintly in her trembling hands. She didn't turn when he approached. She just kept her eyes fixed on the steeple, as if it were the only thing holding her upright. "You shouldn't be out here," Sam said, his voice rough from the wind. "You'll catch your death." She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her words came soft, breaking apart in the rain. "I won't shame her again." He stopped a few paces behind her, water dripping from his hat, his breath visible in the cold air. "What are you talking about?" She looked down at the locket in her hands, thumb tracing the worn engraving. "She deserves her life," she whispered. "Her world's clean now, polished and proper. Folks like me don't fit in it. I came here hoping maybe she'd remember. But I see now. That was my selfishness talking." Her shoulders shook, but she didn't cry. Not exactly. The rain did the crying for her. "If she wants to forget me," she said, "I'll let her." Sam stepped closer, slowly, careful not to startle her. "Margaret," he said, the name heavy in his throat. "You listened to me. You didn't shame her. She shamed herself. You gave her life. You gave her love. That's more than most folks ever get." She finally turned to him, her eyes tired but clear. "And what's that love worth now?" she asked quietly. I'm just a ghost walking through what's left of it. Sam took his coat off and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric hung, heavy with rain, but his hands were steady. It's worth you being here, he said. Worth breathing, worth remembering. You deserve your life, same as anyone. For a long moment she didn't speak. The wind rattled the church door, and the bell rope swayed just enough to make a low, mournful sound. Finally, she looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was something like peace in her eyes, not happiness, not forgiveness, just quiet acceptance. You're a good man, Sam Dwyer, she said softly. Too good for a soul like mine. He shook his head. Ain't about good or bad, he said. It's about what's right. She nodded once, clutching the locket tighter. Then right now I reckon what's right is letting her be. He wanted to argue, to tell her that walking away again would break something in her that couldn't be fixed. But he saw the resolve in her face and knew it wouldn't change. So instead, he stood beside her, both of them staring up at the steeple as the rain fell harder, washing the dust and sin from everything it touched. When she finally took his arm for balance, he said nothing, just led her gently back toward the horse, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. They walked in silence through the storm, two lonely figures bound by the kind of understanding words could never reach. And somewhere behind them, the church bell groaned once in the wind, like heaven itself sighing for the things that couldn't be undone. Morning came pale and cold, the world still heavy with rain, the smell of wet earth rising like something reborn. Sam was up before dawn, the fire crackling low as he saddled the horses. Margaret sat at the table, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the locket resting in her hands. Neither had slept much, but when he told her he was riding into town, she looked up and said, quietly but firmly, "Then I'm coming with you." There was no arguing it. Something in her voice, tired but resolute, told him this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about ending a chapter that had festered too long in silence. The trail to Dunswell was still slick with mud, the air damp and sharp with the smell of sage. Sam rode close, keeping an eye on her frail figure as the sun broke through the clouds, spilling pale light across the fields. By the time they reached Main Street, folks were already stirring, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, wagons rolling through puddles, the blacksmith's hammer ringing like a bell of routine. But when people saw who rode in beside Sam Dwyer, the rhythm of the morning changed. Heads turned, conversations stopped. Margaret Finch, the old woman thought dead or disgraced, had come walking back into town like a ghost that refused to stay buried. Clara Hensley stood outside the bank again, her fine silk dress immaculate against the muddy street. Her husband beside her, talking with the sheriff. She saw them first, and for a heartbeat, the color drained from her face. The murmur of the crowd spread fast, whispers cutting through the air like wind through wheat. "That's her mother," someone said. "Didn't she leave the poor thing at the post?" Another voice, sharper. "Guess ghosts do come back." Sam dismounted slowly, offering a hand to Margaret, who took it with trembling fingers. She stepped down onto the street, the hem of her faded dress soaking through in the puddles. But she stood tall all the same. Clara's husband turned, his polished smile curdling when he saw them approach. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, voice dripping with disdain. "Who's the vagrant you've brought here, Dwyer?" Sam's jaw tightened. "Name's Margaret Finch," he said evenly. "And she ain't no vagrant. She's your wife's kin." The banker's brow furrowed, then twisted into a sneer. "Nonsense. My wife's family is respectable. This woman is. She's my mother." Clara's voice cut through his words like a whip crack. The entire street went still. Even the horses seemed to stop shifting, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Clara's face had gone white, but her eyes burned with something fierce and desperate. Her husband stared at her, stunned, then scoffed. "Don't be absurd," he said. "You expect these people to believe you're the daughter of a beggar?" She turned on him then, voice shaking but strong. "Yes, I am." The admission broke from her like a confession she'd been choking on for years. "I'm the daughter of a woman who worked herself half to death so I could have more than she did. And I left her behind because I was too proud to let the world see where I came from." The banker's face flushed crimson, his jaw clenching as the whispers around them grew. "You'll ruin us. he hissed. "You'll ruin me." He threw a glare at Sam, then at Margaret, before storming off toward the bank, his boots splashing mud with every furious step. The doors slammed behind him, the sound echoing down the street like a final verdict. Silence settled over the crowd again, thick and uneasy. Clara stood trembling, her shoulders heaving, tears mingling with the remnants of rain on her cheeks. Then, slowly, she turned to face her mother. Margaret didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, water dripping from her shawl, the locket shining faintly at her throat. Clara took one hesitant step forward, then another, before finally falling to her knees in the mud before her. "Mama," she whispered, the word breaking apart as it left her lips. "I'm sorry. I was so ashamed of the wrong things." Margaret's breath hitched, her hand rising as if uncertain whether to touch her or not. "Oh, my girl," she murmured, voice trembling. "All I ever wanted was to see you happy." "I wasn't," Clara said through tears. "Not once." Sam watched in silence, his hat held over his chest, the sight of it stirring something deep and unnameable in him. Around them, the townsfolk said nothing, no gossip, no laughter, no judgment. Just quiet, the kind that felt like reverence. Finally, Margaret reached out, her fingers brushing her daughter's cheek. "Then let's start over," she whispered. Clara nodded, clutching her mother's hand like a lifeline. The rain began again, soft this time, washing the dust and shame from the street as if heaven itself had been waiting for this moment. And for the first time in years, Margaret Finch didn't feel like part of the dust. She felt seen, alive, and forgiven. The rain had eased by afternoon, leaving the air washed clean. The sky, a pale, trembling blue, stretched over the quiet town. The street outside the bank was nearly empty now, the onlookers gone back to their errands, though every window curtain still quivered with unseen eyes. Margaret and Clara stood together by the church fence, mother and daughter side by side for the first time in years, but the distance between them felt wider than the prairie. The mud clung to Clara's fine skirts, the hem ruined, but she didn't seem to notice. She gripped her mother's hands tightly, tears still fresh on her cheeks. "Come home with me," she said, her voice breaking, the words tumbling out like she was afraid if she stopped speaking, Margaret might vanish again. "Please. We'll fix this. You'll have a bed, a doctor, new dresses, everything I promised you once." Margaret smiled faintly, the kind of sad, knowing smile only age and sorrow can shape. "Child," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "I've had all those things before. None of them ever kept me warm." Clara shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. "You don't understand. They'll talk about you, about me, about what I did. I can't face them if you're not with me." Margaret's fingers tightened around her daughter's, not harshly, but with the weight of truth. "You've already faced worse, my girl. But you've built yourself a world that's clean and bright, and it don't have room for ghosts like me. I don't belong in it anymore." "You do," Clara whispered fiercely. "You do. You belong with me." Sam stood a few paces away, hat in his hands, the brim dripping with the last of the rain. He'd watched their reunion in silence, but now he stepped forward, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. "Sometimes leaving ain't punishment," he said. "It's peace." Clara turned to him, startled, as if she'd forgotten he was there. His eyes met Margaret's, and he saw the understanding already written in them. She nodded once, slow and sure. "He's right," she said softly. "There's a kind of freedom in letting go of what was, and what can't be fixed." Clara's lip trembled, her hand clutching at her mother's as if she could anchor her by will alone. "I can't lose you again," she whispered. Margaret brushed a stray curl from her daughter's face, her fingers gentle, trembling. "You won't," she said. "Not really. You'll carry me with you in how you speak, how you love, how you forgive yourself. That's all a mother ever asks." The younger woman sobbed, folding into her mother's arms, and for a long, quiet moment, the two simply held each other as the wind whispered through the wet leaves above. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret turned to Sam, her expression calm, resolved. "I reckon I've troubled you enough," she said, though her voice carried no shame. "You've been kind when no one else would." Sam shook his head. You've earned your kindness, ma'am. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She smiled faintly at that, then looked back to her daughter one last time. You have your world, Clara, she said gently. Mine's out there. Clara's tears fell freely now, but she nodded, knowing her mother's will was stronger than any plea she could make. Will you be all right? She asked. I will, Margaret said, her voice steady as the horizon. For the first time in a long while, Sam offered his arm, and she took it, light but sure. As they walked down the muddy street, Margaret didn't glance back, though Sam saw the reflection of her daughter in her eyes, a past she had finally forgiven, not forgotten. The sun broke through the clouds then, spilling gold across the wet rooftops, the kind of light that felt like a benediction. And as they reached the edge of town, Margaret paused, breathing in the scent of rain and sage, her face lifted to the wind. Peace, she whispered, almost to herself. It's been a long time coming. Sam tipped his hat, and they rode on together, leaving behind the whispers, the pity, and the chains of what had been. She didn't need comfort. She had her dignity, and that, at last, was enough. The weeks that followed passed like a slow healing, the kind of quiet stretch of time that sneaks up on a person and shows them they've survived. The land was greening again, wildflowers blooming in soft bursts of color across the prairie, the river running clear after the rains. Sam rode out with Margaret most mornings, helping her haul timber and nails up the ridge to the old cabin that had been abandoned for years, a gray, leaning thing with a roof half collapsed and ivy creeping through its cracks. Most folks would have called it hopeless, but Margaret saw something else when she first laid eyes on it. It's small, she'd said, running her palm along the weathered porch rail, but it's honest. And that was all the reason Sam needed to make it livable again. Together, they set to work. He hammered boards while she swept out years of dust and cobwebs, humming soft hymns under her breath. She patched curtains from old feed sacks, cleaned the soot-black stove until it gleamed, and started a little garden out back with seeds she'd traded for in town. Her hands, which had once trembled with age and sorrow, grew steady again, the skin browned by sun and streaked with earth. Never thought I'd start over this late, she said one afternoon, pausing to catch her breath as they planted wildflowers along the porch. The breeze lifted her hair, and for the first time since he'd met her, Sam saw color in her cheeks that wasn't from the cold. He leaned on his shovel, watching her work, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Ain't about how late, he said. It's about finally. She looked up at him, eyes bright with something between amusement and gratitude. Finally, she echoed softly, like she was testing the word after years of forgetting how to say it. They worked until the sun dipped low, and the light turned honey gold, casting long shadows across the ridge. When they sat on the porch steps that evening, their boots dusty, the wildflowers newly planted at their feet, the silence between them felt easy-earned. Down below, Sam's ranch lay quiet, the cattle grazing in the fading light, the river glinting like a silver thread through the grass. Margaret held her locket in her lap, but she didn't open it anymore. She just traced the edge with her thumb, a small, contented smile playing on her lips. You ever think the Lord gives us second chances? She asked after a while, her voice low, steady. Sam tipped his hat back, eyes fixed on the horizon. Reckon he gives us what we're willing to reach for, he said. Some folks call that chance. Others call it grace. She nodded slowly, the meaning of it settling deep in her chest. Then I reckon I've found mine. The air was sweet with the smell of rain and new earth. A pair of sparrows flitted across the yard, their wings catching the last rays of daylight. Sam stood, stretching his back with a quiet grunt. Roof still, needs fixin', he said, nodding toward the crooked shingles. Margaret smiled. Then we best get to it tomorrow. Tomorrow, he agreed. As he walked down toward his horse, she watched him go, the weight of solitude that had followed her for so long finally loosening its grip. When he glanced back, she was still there on the porch, framed by the wildflowers she'd planted, roots taking hold in the same ground she once thought she'd die on. He tipped his hat, and she lifted her hand in return, her heart lighter than she could remember it ever being. That night, When the stars came out sharp and countless above the prairie, Margaret lay in her small bed beneath a patched quilt, listening to the wind slide through the cracks of the cabin walls. But this time, it didn't sound like loneliness. It sounded like home. Spring came slow that year, cautious, like the earth was testing whether it was safe to bloom again. The snow melt trickled down from the ridge and turned the fields soft and gold, wildflowers spilling across the valley like spilled paint. And for the first time in a long while, the Rawlins Ridge didn't look like a place that had known sorrow. It looked like it was breathing again. Travelers on the Carson Trail began to notice it too. That small cabin perched near the bend in the river, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, the scent of bread or stew drifting downwind to meet them. They'd tip their hats and whisper stories about the old woman who lived there, the one with silver hair and a smile that came easy, who waved at every wagon that passed. Sometimes, they said, she sat beside a broad-shouldered cowboy in a weathered hat, the two of them rocking in quiet rhythm on the porch, not saying much but seeming to say everything that mattered. His name, they learned, was Sam Dwyer, a ranch hand, widower, and the sort of man who carried decency like other folks carried pride, quiet, worn smooth, and never for show. Her name was Margaret Finch, though the folks who stopped by for coffee or a warm meal often called her Miss Maggie, and she never corrected them. The story of what brought her there was a whisper that traveled faster than the wind, how she'd been left behind once, forgotten, but somehow found her way back to herself. And maybe that was why travelers came to linger at her porch, why drifters and peddlers found comfort there when they had nowhere else to go. There was something in her laugh, soft, sure, steady as the rocking chair beneath her, that made even the loneliest hearts feel a little less hollow. Some said it was the way her voice carried through the dusk when she hummed old hymns, the ones that sounded like they belonged to both heaven and heartbreak. Others said it was the cowboy beside her, how he always looked at her like she was the truest thing left in the world. "Ain't much to look at," he'd tell visitors with a grin, nodding at the cabin, "but it's home." And Margaret would chuckle, her eyes shining. "You're wrong, Sam," she'd say. "It's more than much, it's enough." As spring deepened, the wildflowers she'd planted bloomed in a riot of color along the porch rail, their petals brushing against the boards with every breeze. Sometimes she'd reach down to touch them, her fingers gentle, her smile distant but peaceful, as if she were remembering the girl she once was and the woman she became. On warm evenings, when the horizon bled gold and the cattle grazed quiet below, she'd open the old silver locket, the one that had once been her burden and was now her prayer. Inside, the faces of her daughter and granddaughter looked back, still young, still unbroken by the years. She'd trace the edges with a fingertip and whisper into the wind, "Thank you, Sam, for finding me when I'd already given up." Sometimes he heard her. Sometimes he pretended not to. But always he'd look out toward the horizon with that same quiet calm and say, "You found yourself, Maggie. I just happened to be riding by." The world around them didn't stop turning. Storms still came, dust still rose, but somehow it all felt lighter now, as if the land itself had made room for hope again. And so they rocked together through the seasons, two souls who'd been broken by life and mended by kindness, while the sun went down and the prairie turned to gold, proving that even in the hardest places, something beautiful could still take root.